It was a hot day in the spring of 1982 when 20-year-old Chapman University student Tessa Dick pulled up to an intersection in El Medina, Orange County, California. Tessa is the fifth ex-wife of famous science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. She sat and waited for the light to change. Her car didn't have air conditioning, so she rolled down the window to get some fresh air. What happened next was really strange, and Tessa wrote about it to a paranormal investigator named Linda Gottfried. Tessa says a black limousine pulled up next to my car, and the rear window went down. I saw a beautiful black German shepherd sitting there in the back seat of the limousine next to the open window. I could see the dog's head, but not his body. I was looking at the dog and smiling, and the dog was smiling back at me. He looked intelligent, and he was clean and well groomed. I thought that the owner of the limousine simply had a beautiful dog. Somehow, without knowing how or why, I simply knew that the dog was male. But then, just before the light turned green, the dog casually put his arm on the window ledge and he had a hand. My jaw dropped and the dog smirked. I thought he was chuckling, pleased with himself that he had shocked me by showing me his hand. It looked like a human hand with fingernails, well manicured, and coal black skin like his hair. His arm had short black hair like the hair on a dog's front leg, but his hand was hairless, and the arm had an elbow and shoulder like a human elbow and shoulder. The light turned green and we both drove away. I never saw that limousine or the dog again. I tried to find some kind of ape or monkey with a face like that, but no such animal exists. And of course, dogs don't have human hands. So what did I see? Now, I think that the dog owns the limousine rather than being the pet of a human. After hearing this story, Linda Gottfried asked Tessa if she noticed any clothes or maybe a watch on the creature, but the answer was no, not even the dog's collar. Interestingly, Tessa didn't seem to feel fear. She was just shocked and curious. She was particularly amazed that such a creature would appear in a city and ride a car instead of wandering somewhere in the desert far from civilization. The city is bordered by Santiago Oaks Regional Park, Lake Irvine, Cleveland National Forest, and the Santa Ana Mountains, which means they have plenty of places to go. The vision seemed both personal and intentional to Tessa, probably due to the determined nature of the anonymous creature, like revealing its waiting hand and then smiling back at Tessa's shock. I always thought this vision was meant for specifically me, but I don't know whether to take it as a gift or a threat. Donald Childs was only 35 years old, and that fact probably helped him survive a heart attack caused by seeing a monster in his front yard. He got out of the hospital 2 days after the incident. When asked about the sighting, he told local police officer Clancy Williams of a tall humanoid creature with a hairy face and an indescribable collection of clothes on its body. This report would be the first of many in Lawton, Oklahoma in 1971. Some of the first reports of sightings after Donalds went to police in Oklahoma. The monster was described as wearing pants that were much too small for him. In West Lawton, people claimed to see something monstrous running down the street, dodging cars, and causing nothing but chaos. It ducked behind some bushes before getting up and continuing to run. According to Officer Henry Izell, apparently it took 20 minutes before the monster got off the road and ran onto private property. An unnamed man soon called the police and reported seeing a humanoid horror sitting in front of his second floor apartment. He first saw the creature when he opened his curtains around 11:15 a.m. The unnamed witness initially thought the strange sight was a joke because it was balanced on the railing in what was described as a comical manner. However, he soon realized it was no laughing matter when the creature turned his head to look at him. He claimed that it resembled a monkey or an ape. His face was horribly disfigured as if he had survived a fire, and his face, upper body, and legs were covered in hair. It was wearing tiny pants that covered its legs down to the knees. Looking at the horrified man, it suddenly jumped from the perch, falling 17 feet and landing perfectly on the ground. Seemingly unfazed by the massive fall, it was soon running on all fours, moving something similar to what the anonymous person imagined a running monkey would do. The monster seemed to move very quickly. It was at Fort Sill in 15 minutes, where it scared a bunch of soldiers. These usually tough men had to admit that this creature really scared them. The werewolf was seen on Friday and Saturday night before his reign of terror came to an abrupt halt on Sunday. On Monday night, Major Clarence Hill, commander of the local police patrol division, sent out an alert to ask his men to be on the lookout for werewolves. Despite this, the monster never appeared again, seemingly disappearing back into the dark dimension from which it originally emerged. Interestingly, the monster was seen in Arkansas on May 1st, and Brad Steger initially connected the two. It has been suggested that this panic was orchestrated by a teenager at the local high school. Apparently, he just wore a mask and jumped out of the bushes at people and was quite a known troublemaker in the area. The front page of the Lawton Constitution apparently featured a photo of the local police chief wearing the mask in question and laughing to himself. It is interesting to note that the werewolf was apparently never described as having a dog's muzzle. Instead, it had a grotesque and hairy face and moved like a prey. One would almost have to suggest an ape or an hairy humanoid identity for the creature in question, if it were not for the creature's legs wearing shorts. Some people have speculated that all the panic may have been caused by a hoaxer in a werewolf costume, but that becomes unlikely when you face the fact that the creature went away and perfectly landed a 17-foot drop. It was early June 2016 in southern New York, and three friends, Jamie, Dan, and an unnamed witness, decided to go camping on a mountain. Apparently, they didn't know if they were technically allowed to do it, but there were a lot of fire pits in the area, so they did it anyway. They set up tents and made fires and just sat around drinking beer and bitching about our woman. Suddenly, the forest became completely quiet. Didn't even hear crickets, and there must have been what appeared to be a lightning storm because static electricity was felt in the air. The hairs on the neck of the anonymous witness stood up. According to Jamie, the air hummed. Immediately after that, there was a deep bass rumble and a light flashed in the distance, illuminating the entire forest. For the first few seconds, it looked like a big firework went off, but it took about a minute before it split into 3 or 4 other lights and shot back into the trees. We saw lights in the forest shining, and then there was a big gust of wind and it was gone. Everything smelled like it had rained, but it never rained. The witness didn't know what to do, but decided it was probably just a meteor and went back to talk to each other. Around 2, they decided to go to bed. The unnamed witness and Jamie slept in a tent, but Dan decided to sleep by the fire. About an hour later, Dan wakes the others by shaking them and saying that something big has been watching the fire. According to Dan, the creature was about 50 feet away from the fire, and he thought it might be a bear, but it was standing on two legs and swaying back and forth as if it was trying to get a better look at him. While Dan was speaking to the witness about this, all three of them heard a loud cry, which apparently sounded like a pig being slaughtered, but was deeper and made the ears of the witnesses ring. Apparently, 3 or 4 other creatures ran into the campsite as coals were kicked up from the fire and landed on the tents. The dogmen kept running up to the tent and then quickly ran back in the forest. From time to time, one of them screamed again and grabbed the tent pole and dragged the whole tent a foot or two. By now, the whole tent was collapsing on one side, and the witnesses screamed as loud as they could. Suddenly, everyone fell silent again as the witnesses ran as fast as they could to their car and hit the gas. When they were about to leave, they saw one of the dogs on the road lit by the headlights of the truck. At that point, the witnesses tried to speed the vehicle straight past the creature, but then it straightened up and puffed its chest. The witness estimated the creature to be about 8 feet tall, and its body was dark gray except for the front where the hair was white or yellow. The face looked like a dog's face, but not quite. Apparently, the witness knows what Bigfoot looks like, and it was different. The dog man didn't move even when the witness drove towards it and swerved the truck around it to not run over it. They drove back down the hill and parked the truck and considered telling the local police, but were discouraged because they didn't know if they were allowed to be camping there. In the morning, when the witnesses recovered, they drove back to the campsite to find their belongings, including the tent and cooler, gone. When she was young, her father always took her and her siblings to walk in the nearby woods. The forest was apparently so dense that even on an unusually hot day like this one, the sun was not able to shine through all the leaves, which meant the forest was much darker and cooler. She wandered off on her own and did not know how far she had gone in the wilderness, but the feeling that she was too deep in the forest hit her when she noticed something crouching behind a nearby tree. It was hard to tell at first, but she saw that its massive arms were wrapped around the tree trunk and that it was bending its head to look at her. As she approached it, it became clear that it was covered in long, matted black and brown hair, and that it appeared to have a muzzle and pointed ears. Her father let her watch strange but true, so she concluded immediately that she had seen a modern werewolf. It never moved, it just watched her as she walked around. Fear swelled in her, and in a sudden panic she turned back the way she had came and ran towards the light at the end of the forest. Running as fast as her legs could carry her, she turned for a moment to check if the monster was following her, but as soon as she turned back, she was suddenly struck in the face. Red fluid ran down her cheek, and she realized she had hit a tree head on. She walked through the forest confused until she found her father, and it took weeks for the wounds on her head to heal. There wasn't another soul in the area, so she is still utterly stumped as to what exactly it was that frightened her so badly that she ran face first into a tree. An anonymous witness was in the military stationed at 29 Palms in the 1970s. One evening, he and a friend decided to drive into the surrounding deserts to the Joshua Tree National Monument. They cruised along the road and talked loudly and animatedly, enjoying the cool night air. However, their peace of mind was disturbed when they encountered a monster that looked straight out of a Hollywood movie. The first sign that something was wrong came when the witness suddenly heard a loud and repeated knock on the driver's side door. At first, he thought he must have hit an animal and it must have hit the window. So he stopped to check. There was nothing at the door and no animal on the road. Confused but eager to take off, he got back into the car and the pair continued driving. They only made it a few miles when the noise happened again, but this time on the passenger door. His friend started to get scared, but the witness who tells the story still thought it was probably car related. He thought he was driving with a flat tire. The frustrated witness stopped again at this point and got out. He systematically checked all the tires and doors, but still couldn't find anything that could be causing the strange noises. Restarting the drive a second time, they didn't get very far before the car suddenly stopped working. The lights went out and it started to slow down. So the witness hit the brake out of fear, stopping it in the middle of the road. He and his friend just sat there in eerie silence before the car sprang to life as suddenly as it had stopped. Because of the make of the car, the lights automatically turned on and illuminated the road ahead of them. To their horror, a figure was by the side of the road, crouched down to the passenger side of the car. It looked like a Hollywood movie creature and was described as a large dog with a head comparable to that of a werewolf in the movie The Howling. Both men panicked and screamed loudly in fear. The witness hit the gas, and in a hurry, they saw the monster stand up and run across the road. Almost 20 years after the incident, the witness heard a biology professor mention cryptozoology. He told him the story about the creature in the desert, and the professor, who happened to be a folklore collector, told him that what he saw might be a Nagual, a shape-shifting witch from Mesoamerican folklore who was known to have the ability to transform itself into many animal-like forms. When the witness told his story on a now defunct online forum, he claimed he didn't want to be named for fear of ridicule. 23 years later, after their encounter, in April 2015, Ken and Sarah spoke with cryptozoologist Linda Godfrey to share their story of something haunting they witnessed along with hundreds of others on Sunday at a quaint Midwestern Baptist church worship service. This church was just on the edge of a small town surrounded by a flat area with rivers and a small lake. Godfried investigated this extraordinary story in depth, but the witnesses agreed to publish their stories only on the condition that they were given strict anonymity. The couple were in their 60s, and Godfrey described them as very reliable, interviewed them several times, and thoroughly researched every aspect of their story, tracking down and successfully obtaining every verifiable detail. Ken was a Vietnam veteran who worked in the construction industry for years, while Sarah was a stay-at-home mom who worked part-time at the church. At the time, the very place she ended up having a face-to-face encounter with the unknown and possibly demonic creature. This church seems to no longer exist, and the land it once stood on has changed owners several times since the incident. That fateful Sunday morning in 1992, according to Sarah, was a strange day, and a big-boned, middle-aged woman who was relatively new to the church wandered into the room and sat quite close to Sarah and her family in the front row of pews. Only about 10 feet away from them, they had a good view of her among about 225 church members because the pews were arranged in a semicircle. The priest was on a stage in front of the church giving his sermon, standing only about 20 feet from where the woman sat. Ken noticed that her eyes kept turning to him and that she seemed to have a strange grayness. He could just tell that there was something strange about her. Sarah felt as strangely drawn to the mysterious woman as her husband, describing her as having dark hair and very ordinary features. She was wearing black pants and a white shirt, and she seemed to be fidgeting quite a bit. The pastor finished his sermon and walked past the strange woman in the congregation to sit with his wife and family. He grabbed his Bible and papers before leaving the stage and heading towards her, apparently prompting her to stand up and let out a bloody, curdling scream. She twisted her head and body in a grotesque but indescribable manner before suddenly transforming into a wolf-like creature. Ken described how the animal somehow got out of the woman. He then described it as a bipedal creature with legs, which he compared to the Greek god Pan. It smelled of sulfur, and its terrible roar and scream echoed through the church. Sarah described the strange scene before her in more detail, specifying that her transformation into a monster was instantaneous and without any visible metamorphosis. The woman's clothes were apparently completely gone because the monster's body bore no trace of the clothes it had previously worn. She described the face of the creature as not really a wolf's face, but instead that of a baboon's. Her eyes were black in color, and her teeth grew 4 inches. Its gray-haired frame was massively built, tapering to a slender waist before returning to muscular thighs. The legs were thinner and ended in hooves about 5 to 6 inches long. As the minister passed her, moments before her transformation, the monster that came out of her put its claws up while keeping its elbows at its waist and dropped its head to face the ground before turning from side to side. According to Sarah, its hands were raised and its fingers were curved. Ken got the impression it was truly evil and said it seemed very angry but also defensive. Interestingly, he compared the creature's teeth to those of a Vietnamese deer, and the animal's roar lasted for several minutes. The whole church was paralyzed with fear, just sat there before they began to pray feverishly. Ken says he thinks the whole thing would have turned violent if it weren't for the church situation. Sarah's daughter asked what it was, to which she said she hadn't looked at it and that it was just a woman having an epileptic fit. The 18-year-old daughter immediately dismissed this as an obvious lie and asked if her mother thought she was stupid. The minister was the first to react to the monster, stopping walking and reaching out before confidently saying, "Satan, you have no power here." At this, the animal began to grunt and pant as if determined to fight or flee, and using the time it had bought. An usher named Tom came up behind it and grabbed it to take it to the ground onto a pew. 4 more ushers rushed to the scene to help Tom hold the creature down, and there was a terrible scream as the monster disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Tom was left on the bench with her, restored to her normal normal clothed appearance almost in his arms. A team of ushers were able to drag the woman into another room when she appeared to look dazed. The congregation began muttering amongst themselves, wanting to know if the others had just seen what they had. Sarah felt that the people were really shocked, as anyone would be, and were reluctant to talk about what happened. Since then, no one has mentioned it, perhaps to protect the reputation of their church. But as soon as she could, Sarah ran out of the church, got into her car, and started crying. Her children were very affected, and one of them was shaking and depressed, just wanting to leave. Ken was able to ask the priest if he had just seen what he thought he saw, to which he replied yes. Apparently, the minister told Tom not to ever touch one of those again. The woman was kept at the church until the elders determined she was no longer an immediate threat, tending to her before she was apparently moved to another location where people could examine her. The minister and his elders seemed to believe that they had just successfully exorcised the demon entity from the woman. Gottfried asked Ken if he knew where she was taken, but unfortunately he didn't. He also added that most of the ushers who helped capture the monster are now either very old or deceased. The whole incident had apparently been caught on video camera thanks to the church's usual practice of taping services, but when Ken inquired as to if he could view the tape, he was told the church no longer had it. He was told that it was no longer in the hands of the church. Either they had given it to someone else or destroyed it. Ken says that he has no idea what he saw in the church that day, and that the only conclusion he can come to is that it was some kind of demon. He believes that it possessed the woman and that its monstrous appearance may have been it showing its power. The woman presumably left town after the incident, as Ken and Sarah never heard from her again. Shortly after the incident, the congregation also disbanded and the priest left town. Gottfried managed to contact the pastor, but he quickly shut her down, saying he never discusses his past pastoral duties, apparently standard practice among ministers. Ken and Sarah also managed to reconnect with some of the people who were there when the werewolf appeared, but when asked what they remembered, they just got disappointing answers like, "What happens in church stays in church." However, most of the congregation was not in a good position to see the creature due to the arrangement of the pews. This view would have been further obscured by the ushers who quickly surrounded the creature after its appearance. Gottfried was shocked by the incident and skeptically hypothesized that perhaps the apparition was a mass hallucination caused by religious zeal, but then considered it unlikely because the congregation was not very enthusiastic then, but simply waited for their priest to sit down, and the existence of the phenomenon of a mass hallucination has not been proven in the first place. The night of October 14th, 1996, something strange was waiting in the dark sky over Israel. An object of blinding blue, red, and white light hovered over the city of Acre in northern Israel, soaring the sky towards the dunes of the surrounding coastal plain before suddenly stopping and falling close to the ground, casting an eerie light on the surrounding area. It is not known in what order the following events took place, but it is clear that on the night beings descended upon Israel, never seen before or since. Tamara was watching the shining object as it descended from the clouds and hovered above her city. She was outside near her home when a different light show from what was happening in the sky began around her. Small creatures glowing with red light came towards her and began to attack. The creatures were able to injure Tamara before she escaped. Later that night, a man named Abdul Al-Zurad, who was driving, noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. Abdul stopped and the man asked for a lift. Abdul agreed and the man got into the passenger seat of his car. He continued driving down the dirt road ahead of him, looking at his new companion. He was horrified to see his appearance transform into something monstrous. The man changed in seconds until he was no longer a recognizable person. In his place sat a tall humanoid dressed in dark clothes. It had a dog's head, floppy ears, and one cyclops eye at the top of a long snout. In a panic, probably realizing he was sitting next to what he called a demon, Abdul braked hard, sending the car off the road. After opening the door, Abdul ran out of the car as fast as he could, afraid to even look behind him. He ran and ran, finally getting a safe enough distance from the supernatural tormentor to look at the wreckage of his car. His heart sank as he watched the nightmarish creature climb out of the passenger side door before walking towards him. Then the apparition disappeared without further explanation. That same night, two men were driving on a dark road in the Negev desert near the city of Bir Ispa in southern Israel when they saw a man standing in the sand next to an asphalt road. They were in the middle of nowhere and it was getting late, so they decided to slow their car to stop next to the man to see if he needed help. One of them rolled down his window and spoke to him, but received no response. Instead, it slammed its palm against the car door, and witnesses were horrified to discover that the strange figure was not a man, and that its hand was now somehow attached to their car. They managed to catch a glimpse of the creature's face, and it was described as a terrible mutation. In response, the driver stepped hard on the accelerator pedal, and the car sped away from the monster. It then jumped and hurtled about 20 feet through the air, landing again on the side of the door. It gripped the metal like Spider-Man and held the door firmly even when the car and its panicked occupants went past 75 kilometers per hour on the highway. Nothing they did seemed to drive the monster away until it mysteriously vanished into thin air about half a mile of sheer terror later. On July 7th, 2008, a woman in Brazil claimed to have seen a half-man, half-wolf. She was so horrified by the sight that she quickly reported it to local police. However, this would not be an isolated incident. It was just the beginning of a nightmare werewolf panic in several regions of Brazil. A day later, an unnamed woman reported her sighting. A 12-year-old boy came forward and told police that he saw a terrifying figure lurking outside his house. In both cases, the monster involved was described as very ugly and smelling of sulfur. The events continued to escalate 3 days later when the police received 2 reports of werewolf-like creatures stealing local sheep and breaking into several houses. It seemed more likely to him that there were common criminals who used werewolf masks to frighten the villagers by stealing the sheep. He confirmed that the police were looking for a group of criminals who acted like Scooby-Doo villains rather than hunting legal werewolves, calling those who reported seeing a monster innocent and naive. Priests warned their congregations to pray and keep their crucifixes with them at all times. As the news of these strange occurrences spreads, some people started calling Tuya the werewolf capital of South America. Early that year, another mysterious creature caused panic among the citizens. It was April 2008, and a humanoid simply known as the Black Caped Man was on a nightly rampage. Very little is known about this brief hysteria, but deputy of the local police, Eduardo Santana Finn, decided that the reports were just folklore, and his men had more important things to attend to. Local priests thought that spiritual emergency measures must be taken against this shadowy ghost. He handed out crucifixes sprayed with red paint to scare away the man in the black cape. On the night of January 28th, 2009, Kelly Martins Becker was attacked by a very strange animal. She described it as looking like a large dog, but standing on its hind legs and walking like a human. She reported her terrifying encounter to police, claiming the monster scratched her face and arms. The police then told the press that a medical examination of Kelly confirmed the presence of injuries. As in Tuea less than a year ago, police once again ignored suspicions that a violent criminal was walking around in a monster costume. A fourth and final incident, apparently involving werewolves, happened in August 2012. The witness, Marcos, lived near a large lake. Several nights before the encounter, he heard strange sounds from the lake valley. One of his friends who lived near him in the same valley was a shepherd and had lost two of his sheep in recent days. No remains were found at the scene, but large dog tracks were left in the mud at the edge of the lake. He and this angry shepherd decided to join forces and wait for the night to look for the source of sounds in case they came back. It was around 11 p.m. when the strange growls began, coming from the swampy area on Marco's property. Both men carried weapons and hoped to capture the pest, which they believed to be a wild dog or coyote. They had never seen one of these animals in the many years they had lived in the area. But hey, what else could it be? As the men moved closer and closer to the dark swamp, a creature that was more than 2 meters tall rose between them, standing among the weeds. It was hard to see in the dark, but both witnesses immediately concluded that they had seen a werewolf. The creature looked like a man, but had the head and torso of a large dog. Shocked and horrified by this completely unexpected sight, Marcos fired once at the monster. It was unsuccessful, and it made a hasty escape. The two men stood there in stunned silence. It then ran out of the weeds towards them on all fours. It quickly approached its intended prey. It was so close to Marcos that if the shepherd made any move against it, he had to deliberately miss to avoid hitting Marcos accidentally. Frightened by the weapon firing, the werewolf turned and ran back towards the valley. The two witnesses spent another few weeks hunting for the monster, but never heard it again. Some of the locals that they told about it suggests that they had encountered a werewolf. The local authorities refused to search for the creature. It was August 2016, and Jake was the only one in her family who was sober. The family camped in what seemed like miles away from any other civilization. About 4 hours east of the Canada-Michigan border, Jake sat on a wooden chair and watched the crackling fire. And behind her was a small, calm lake. She stood to see the door of the trailer where the family was staying, but she could barely see anything because it was dark. It was around 2 in the morning, and suddenly the flames caught the eye of something standing in the doorway in front of her. The fire was only 3 feet from Jake, so the entity behind it was indeed too close for comfort. It seemed to be leaning against the frame of the trailer door and appeared to be looking at Jake and her family with its huge black eyes. Jake described it as long but not huge, and had the face of a dog. Stunned, she stared at the creature for about a minute before turning away for a moment to consider what exactly she was seeing. And when she turned back, the creature was gone. A few minutes later, Jake's sister came up from behind her to go into the trailer to use the washroom. And in the confusion, Jake jumped up and went with her. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shined its beam into the dense forest surrounding the campsite, but saw nothing. Despite the sudden disappearance, Jake didn't feel like it teleported or anything because she saw the creature could easily slip into the forest. Although she didn't feel threatened, the creature itself soon became alarmed and left the camp. She was the only one who was sober, and everyone else was hammered in such a mood that they would think it would be a good idea to tease her, so she didn't want to tell them about the encounter for a while. She did tell her sister about it, though, and apparently she thought it might have been an interdimensional creature.